Same grip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
Any rich people here? All right, we want to tell the rich people, don't be jealous of us poor people. Don't be jealous of us poor people. You see, the poor peoples want to feel that they have something by themselves, for themselves. The little bit of hunger and starvation that they have. Let us keep it, rich peoples. Okay? This is called neurosis of the rich. The rich people get neurotic when they think about the attention that's being paid to the old poor people. The song explains itself. Neurotic rich people. I hope you're ready for big English, you know. This one is not a simple, ordinary jump and jam, you know. Big English. Pull out your dictionary and think. Contrary to yesterday, when wealth was a social law, the official concern today revolves around the poor. Their sexual fancies and wild emotion, unemployment, education, ethnic composition have now become interesting studies of exhaustive attention. The rich cannot understand poor people getting so much attention. They cannot live with this rejection. Yes, they would like to be the object of concern, but idleness has no value of its own. The methodology of conspicuous consumption and waste. The display of diamonds and ruby is now commonplace. For the theory today is that wealth in its fear is a source of destruction, frustration, and fear. For the wealthy, life is built on despair. Sing it again. For the wealthy, life is built on despair. See the seller rocking chair for $270,000. That's what they do with money. That's why I could never be rich. Once upon a time, people only had to know that you had more than just a dime to make you a big hero. But now that present scholars and great professors, academic educators, religious advisors occupy all their time working on some Save the Poor project, the rich get very upset at the attention poor people get. They see themselves as sad victims of neglect. Yes, they have so much, but to find companionship every month, they had to take a pleasure trip to gamble away loads of money on roulette and dice. Coasting and toasting and boasting to be recognized. Knowing deep down inside they are faced with extinction, for wealth in itself is no sort of distinction. They exist in a state of disillusion. Sing it again. Yes, they exist in a state of disillusion. sad when a high-class broad, ravaged by gross ill health, Papa, you throw she pride overboard, then combining her rank and wealth with obesity, swollen, tortured face, advanced nymphomania and repellent grace. Pay out large sums of money trying to procure some loving. But true love, I must insist, cannot be captured like this. No, it just cannot be purchased. So they will flock to bars, luncheons and parties, flashing cars, and counting calories in an effort to create distractions. Very great distraction. Flaunting the rank and the wealth to gain acceptance. But that feeling of guilt from deliberate mistakes, night after night, keeps them ever awake. Money heartaches is too much for them to take. Sing it again. Money heartaches is too much for them to take. That is all you got to say. Money heartaches is too much for them to take. Money heartaches is too much for them to take.
Oh, yes. Oh, good evening and welcome to our Open Word podcast, Politics 101, our Open Word podcast. Starting out there with the mighty sparrow, neurosis of the rich. It is why the calypso is a unique art form. Only in calypso you could take a theme like that, poverty and wealth, and put it to music so beautifully. Really a critique of runaway wealth and making the point that the world has to pay attention to poverty. And you all know that on this program, we have made that a part of our mission. Good evening again, whether you're joining us from Guyana, all across Guyana, whether you're joining us from our wider Caribbean, the Caribbean region. You know, they talk about the Caribbean as a set of islands, but the Caribbean has always been a regional construct. Our Caribbean region, you're joining us from there, welcome. Those of you who are joining us from Europe, from the United Kingdom, from France, I know those two places, we have people who join us every day, every evening from there. And of course, those of you in North America, Canada, the United States of America, and further afield in South America, of course, our neighbors, where lots of our people are in Suriname, in French Guyana. Good evening to you. Good evening. And today we are dealing with the open word in which we examine all things economics and try to link that economics to other aspects of our existence, economics and politics, economics and sociology, economics and culture. And we have to be like that. The mighty sparrow, neurosis of the rich. That's an old calypso. It sounds timely, but Sparrow did that way back in 1975. And when you think that it was around that time, within the first decade of independence in our Caribbean, our Anglophone Caribbean, 62 Jamaican, Trinidad, and 66 Guyana, Barbados, and the others that followed, that part of the focus of scholarship. Here Sparrow talked there about the great academics and professors and so on, that a lot of our scholarship in the English-speaking Caribbean was grappling with this question of poverty way back then. It's not now. It's not now. And our usual guest, Professor Thomas, was part of that. The New World group, as they call themselves. and they had begun to grapple the question of poverty and wealth. And in the Caribbean countries, the governments, not with the same intensity in their policies, they were dealing with the question of wealth and poverty and how to bring people into the mix. They had to. So again, that calypso is 1975, and you would think that it was sung yesterday, but at the time in 1975, the region was grappling with those issues. And as usual, the Calypsonian has a keen ear and a keen eye for what's happening in this society, you know? And as I said, that stanza where he talks about the great professors and academics and so on, he was talking directly about what was happening in our Caribbean at that time. And like I said, our own Professor Clive Thomas was very much in the middle of that discourse. So today we are going to continue our conversation on the economy. We're going to spend some time today dealing with the question of oil. We come back to oil all the time, oil and gas. And you all know that big conversation that is being taking place about ring fencing and the pros and cons of it. Don't bother, we will break it all down for us here and allow it to make sense for us. What are they talking about? Because Professor Clive Thomas is going to talk about ring fencing and revenues coming in from our oil and gas, because the quarrel, part of the quarrel is exactly that. Are we getting enough? Are we projected to get enough? What is it the oil companies are doing that is robbing us of our fair share? What is it our government is doing? We're going to talk about all of that. We're going to get from Professor Thomas's expertise and a glimpse into the WPA's view on these things. Of course, these are topical issues. Let's bring in Professor Thomas right away. Professor Thomas, good evening.
Hey, David. Glad to be here.
Yes, and as you listen there to the Mighty Sparrow in 1975.
I noticed how young he looked.
Yes. And you know, I was making the point there about the Calypsonian paying attention to what's happening in the society. You can go back, way back to the Federation and come right through, and you'll see the Calypso. The Calypso is dealing with the topical issues. And so it is not surprising that Sparrow would craft the Calypso like that at that time.
Years ago.
Yes.
Half a century ago.
Yeah. Half a century ago is that long. And you were very much part of that early searching for a path to development. And I made reference to the New World group. And reflect for us on that period, and so as to bring us to the present.
Well, I on reflection, I believe it was probably intellectually our most revolutionary period. I think the revolutionary capabilities of the region in terms of the scholars and intellects that had come through the system really flourished, finding new dimensions and new areas of inquiry. We brought to focus the issues of integration, issues of development, issues of the world system in which we are located, issues that had to do with colonialism, the past that we had lived through, and the future that we might want to try and construct going forward. And a lot of that still remains amongst some of the leading scholars today.
And as we look at the present, 50 odd years later, would you say that there are things that we have brought with us from that period, that revolutionary period that you refer to, whether consciously or unconsciously. A lot of the work or some of the work that was done in that period is reflected in some of the conversations, some of the policies today.
Yes, some of it is definitely falls into that category. But I think we also have to recognize that times have changed and new openings have become obvious to people in the region. And we have to accommodate that in the way we go forward. I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. How to locate, for example, oil and gas as an opportunity to move the region out of poverty, which has persisted all those 10 decades ago, or 5 decades ago, since Paru sang the song, still continue to be a persistent poverty, much as George Beckford had identified it. It still remains persistent. And I think that times have changed because we have now, within our grasp, the capability and the capacity to make poverty a matter of history for us. That is my feeling, and that is what I'm trying to do at the end of life.
And George Beckford's persistent poverty, I can identify with that. When I entered university for the first time in the late 70s, early 80s, that was a required text at the University of Guyana there in the early 80s. And I was not in economics, I was in politics, but we had to read Beckford's persistent poverty. Professor Thomas, again, because you've done this so many times for us, put poverty in its historical context. Because often when we speak about these issues, some people may think that we are imposing constructs on our countries and our region, rather than see these things as direct outgrowth of our history of denial, our history of bondage, and our history of resistance to denial and bondage. Put poverty in that large historical context for us.
Well, you have to remember that the region was largely founded on the belief that a lot of wealth was located here. Ghana was supposed to be the mythical El Dorado, a place of favored wealth. And that's what the Europeans came here searching for. So at the very beginning, it spoke to the distribution of income, wealth, and their capacities within the region. Because if they came here for wealth, if we had any wealth, were they able to exploit it, extract it, and take it back to Europe so that nothing was left for us? Or were we able to get enough out of it to make a future for ourselves? So that struggle existed ab initio from the very beginning. And as our consciousness grew and became more and more aware that we were living outside of our traditional homelands, people began, outside of Africa and India and so forth, Portugal and wherever it might be, people began to fight more and more for a better distribution of that wealth. So income distribution, poverty, and wealth are all part of the same struggle, the same coordinated response to the search by the Europeans to find wealth in this country that they could extract and take back to Europe. And this is the source of the founding of much of the wealth of Europe. We know it, for example, we can see it through a lot of that in Britain, the founding of the sugar estates and the families connected with that. All that type of history is part of our daily reckoning up to now. So poverty and the distribution of wealth is central to everything that we do. And we always come back to that once we begin to think of how we can move forward as a nation that we've tried to construct out of that initial search for the location of wealth through finding minerals or growing crops that were wanted in Europe.
Professor, continuing with our introduction here, one of the things that has always fascinated me about our Caribbean scholarship is that I never got the sense from the time I was a boy and coming through, that there was a delinking of scholarship from development, from practical, political, and economic development. I know it's not unique to our Caribbean, but I still find it fascinating that the dividing line between scholarship and actual development of a country was not as striking as it was in some other societies. That one of the words that that fascinated me from the beginning was the word praxis. And I remember hearing that term from yourself and Walter Rodney and so on, and without even knowing the weight of the word, it just sounded to me to be something that is revolutionary. Talk about why in our Caribbean, scholarship and the practice of development have been so intertwined.
Well, I think they can get no better example than maybe the University of the West Indies. As an example, when I went there to teach, the Department of Economics, where I went as a lecturer, was no different from the departments in other parts of Britain, where I worked and enjoyed my time as a student. And we had to fight, literally fight, not in terms of fisticuffs, but intellectually fight to make the department one that served an economics that spoke to the needs of the Caribbean peoples, a sort of Caribbean political economy. We literally had to fight every meeting of the department. And the head of the department, I don't want to talk ill of the dead, he was an Englishman, Kennedy, Professor Kennedy. And he recognized what was happening in his department. And I must say, even though he resisted initially, he let the forces go. Beckford, all of us were members of the same department, Gorvin. So it was a real torrent of talent that we had there. And eventually we were able to make the department more oriented towards the region. And that was a momentous transformation of UWI, because it was seen as a college of the University of London. And anything that London University taught was what we taught. So even in the little things of our daily existence, we had to fight tremendous intellectual battles so that we came through the long history of struggle just to be able to express the meaning that we think is important for a university student. So I don't want it to sound as if I'm being unfair to people who are not here to defend themselves. But that was part of the history. So everywhere you went, you had to fight for the national outlook, for the national consciousness to play a role in your interpretation of what is happening. The same thing continues today, because sometimes people get lost in those old conflicts and try to reproduce them in a context now that has changed, but it's not the same as it was in the 1960s and 1970s. You can't be fighting yesterday's war today. So the struggle for ideas continues, and we have come to realize that. And those of us who went through that cauldron know, I think very clearly that the struggle doesn't end with a permanent victory. It has to be a continuous struggle for victories going forward.
continuous struggle for victories going forward. Welcome to Politics 101, our open word edition with Professor Clive Thomas. And we are reflecting on scholarship and the linkage with development. Professor Thomas, I have to ask you two things before we move on. And one has to do with that perspective. You mentioned Beckford and Govan and yourself in one department at UWI in
other people like Brewster and so on.
Yes, Avra Brewster and so forth. But Professor, the outlook that you all fought for, the praxis that you all fought for, on reflection, did that have to do with where you all came from? I mean, in your own case, you come, as you've said over and over in this program, you come from really the bowels of the working class, the poor in the society. And
I say the non-working class, because my mother never really had a job, ever.
There you go. There you go. But
we had no fun in the house.
That's right. That's right. But do you think that social origins, the social origins of people like yourself and others, do you think that had to do with the perspectives and the outlook you all had as scholars and how to link scholarship with things like poverty and development and so forth?
I would hope so. And I would go further and say I would expect so. Because my understanding of people and their family and the evolution of humankind is that it comes through a process of social relations and personal relations within the family structure, within the community and within the wider nation and the wider world as well. So I would figure that we have to be part of the product of this complex environment in which we grew up. And to think otherwise is to create, I think, a false being, because nobody could be isolated that way. Not if they had the only capacity which I think is unique to humankind, and which I mentioned many times in this program, which I think distinguishes us all from everything else in the universe. An infinite universe, is that we have the capacity for consciousness. We have the capacity to understand things, to think things, to recognize the difference between life and death, to recognize the future, recognize that something like time exists. No other species on earth can have that ability. None that we've discovered so far. And that is the unique nature of humankind. And once we realize that we have and know the journey that we have to complete, if we are to fulfill the purpose that has us here. That is my way of seeing it.
As we reflect on our independence journey, our independence project with Professor Clive Thomas, who in a sense has grown up professionally and intellectually with our independence, before we move on to our substantive topic this evening.
Well, that topic had a lot of linkages in it to the past as well. You'll find out when we talk.
Professor, this past Monday, October 16th, marked the 55th anniversary of the Rodney riots, as it is so called, but it is of course more than that. 55 years since Walter Rodney was banned from Jamaica, and for struggling and fighting to teach African history, just as you all were doing in the economics department.
Yeah.
I know Rodney was banned, and there were clashes between protesters protesting his expulsion from Jamaica, became the Rodney riots, and became, if you will, the formal beginning of the so-called Black Power movement. What is not universally known is you yourself, you were subsequently expelled from Jamaica. Talk about those developments, again, within the context of the struggle for a relevant scholarship a scholarship that is relevant to this new independent Caribbean?
Well, Walter Rodney had come to us from having taught in Tanzania, Africa. And he brought with him a deep sense of the clash between civilizations that is represented by colonialism and imperialism. And he was fighting hard to try and transmit this consciousness to the rest of the Caribbean region, and particularly in Jamaica, where he was living then. Although he is from Guyana, I did not go to school with him. I think he's a couple of years younger. And we became friends. And in fact, after when he left, I was thrown out of Jamaica, he invited me to Tanzania, where I went and spent a year, and where I wrote my books on development, dependence and transformation, and so forth. So that was an important point to make, to show the linkages that we had in that period. But I feel that what is perhaps most significant was that the time in which this took place was a very combustible time. Remember, there was a lot of street protests, a lot of rioting, a lot of fighting for positions on the streets in all parts of the world. And some of that was crossed into the Caribbean. The Black Power movements played an important part in it. And I think that added an ingredient of more direct politics, more direct street action, and more activist politics that still remains very important going forward. We can see with incidents that is happening across the Middle East right now.
Professor Clive Thomas there. And Professor, you yourself were later expelled?
Yes, I was. But I was invited back a few years later when the Manley government came to power. And they were under the crunches of the IMF. And they needed some emergency economic advice. And he convened a consultation with some regional academics. And they asked me to come up from Guyana. And the government of Guyana, although we were fighting them, they facilitated a trip by sending a GDF plane with me to take me up to Jamaica for the cabinet meeting and so forth. So that is a positive part of history that has maybe faded a little bit because I haven't had to repeat it too often.
Yes, and I had heard whispers of it, but this is the first time I've gotten the fullness of it. And while you were at it, did the Guyana government ever consult you on the border?
No, they never did.
They never consulted you. Formally, informally?
Not even informally. I mean, the most you might get is somebody might call you and ask you some odd thing that is bothering them at the point in time. What do you think might be the best bank ratio to apply in Guyana because the IMF is coming? You get things like that, which is sort of, I think, a petty rather than a strategic detail.
Yes.
So,
and of course, during that time, it was the time of radical experiments by some government, democratic socialism in Jamaica.
Yeah. That is what Jamaica was trying with.
Right. Cooperative socialism in Guyana. Eric Williams was doing a dance somewhere in between. And the Barbadians were, in their own way, dealing with how to empower poor people. Well, have you talk a little bit about the Barbadian experiment, because they didn't talk about socialism and all of those, but it on the Barrow especially, they did.
I found that they straddled the two positions very well. And it might have a lot to do with the type of politics that emanated in Barbados, where they never tried to push people to the wall, where you had to do it, become a part of something or not. And it gave a flexibility and an independence of thought that I found quite significant among Barbadians. And they were strongly committed, as one can be, to principles of democratic sharing and understanding and tolerance. They were very much like that. The scholars that I knew, they were strong and they were steadfast and they were firm in their beliefs. And they tended to feel that they were superior intellectually because that's why they were that way.
Yeah.
That they had a better understanding of politics. And those in the other countries were falling for slogans rather than theories and tested ideas.
Very interesting, very interesting. See why Trinidad was led by an academic.
I know.
Of tremendous repute.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about Trinidad in those days and the way they grappled with economics. And they had oil, which the rest of us didn't have. Talk a little bit about Trinidad under Williams with oil.
Well, see, Williams has, I think he was, to my mind, the commitment that he needed to make is the one that I'm trying to push. That the countries that have oil have a responsibility to share it with the rest of the region and not to share it as a patrimony, but share it as a shared value, as a shared asset. Because we share values within the region and not as a benefaction to anybody. I think that's very important. And I don't think when I was growing up, we had a sense that Trinidad had gone beyond the cryptic notion that they were not an ATM machine. Mm-hmm. I think that that played an important part in limiting what they were doing. So to them, it was more like having to carry a sick partner, or rather than an organic thing for the family of nations that we represented.
Mm-hmm.
The wealth was never generously shared, and collective decision-making become involved. Same thing can happen in Guyana as it might very well be, because there's very little regional input in the decision-making. And very little, if there's very little regional input, the regional portions play very minor roles in the development of the decision-making process. And without a vision of the Caribbean as a responsibility and not as a benefactor, not as somebody giving something to, we've been in a lot of trouble later on.
Professor Clive Thomas here today reflecting, and you know, I noticed that some of you in the audience are really enjoying this, and I can tell you it wasn't planned, because we had planned to talk, and we are going to talk about the things that we wanted to talk. And I noticed a few of you would have picked up on the fact that Professor was here lifted to Jamaica at the request of Michael Manley by the government of Guyana at a time when he was a fierce critic of the government. And I know some of you PNC supporters, Burnham supporters will say, aha, you see, Burnham wasn't that all bad. Reflection is a good thing because it allows us to really look back into our history at a place where we are a little further removed from it. And so our gaze is armed with time. And there may be conclusions that we would come to today that we may not come to when we are closer to the scene. I'm so glad that you all are enjoying these reflections. Professor, you mentioned Guyana and where we are today. And this past week, a lot of talk in the media about ring fencing, one of those technical terms that has made its way into the popular discourse because it's in the newspapers, on the front page, pages. First of all, what is ring fencing?
Ring fencing is a basic idea that has been around for hundreds of years. Let me give you an example of what might make it clear to you and why the particular phrase ring fencing came into existence. People would have their agricultural properties, the land that they have, but they might be growing crops in it. They might have animals. They might have insects, bees, and so forth, so they have an aviary. They may have small poultry that they're keeping, ducks and chickens. All that is part of the farm. But in most instances, historically, people have tended to put a fence around those activities, largely to protect the asset. So they put a fence around the cattle so they don't further the crops. A fence around the chickens and whatever it is so that dogs don't get to them. Fence around the aviary, the bee houses or whatever you might have, so that people don't get too close to them and get stung. And that's how the notion of ring fencing came. So it's an asset in which you own one asset in which you put a ring fence around several activities that are subsidiary within that asset. And that is how it has evolved and been applied to oil. But it has been applied also far more intensively and widespread to finance and commerce, to banking. Because offshore banking, for example, the bank might ring fence that, so that if they have problems in that area with offshore loans, it doesn't affect their struggles to keep the bank credit worthy in terms of the domestic assets. So the notion of ring fencing is to create a virtual fence around a particular asset that you have, so as to ensure that you minimize the risks and the problems associated with them so they don't impact each other in a negative way. So in all, the idea is that we try to ensure that the individual wells or the individual areas, that reservoirs that we're exploring for or finding oil in, generate an income stream and a cost stream within one virtual closed unit for that reservoir. And then you operate it so that if there's any raising of new funds, let's say for something outside, you go outside the cattle area, go to the chickens area, and you want to develop more chickens, and you expand that. You don't have to let it depend on the profits that are coming in from the poultry or the other crops you're growing. I shouldn't say poultry, I should say from the cattle or other crops you're growing. So it's really a fence around these activities that we've created.
A fence around that.
Yeah. But in the end, anyhow, the taxes got to be paid.
Yeah,
but
and I think
ring fencing tends to speed up the flow of taxes.
That's where I want you to go. When it comes to revenue, and you made reference to the point that you don't take revenue from one to finance the other, and so on. And I think that's where the quarrel is.
Yeah, but in the end, you still have to pay when the entire field is done.
Exactly.
Because if you advance the profits from, let's say, Leaser 1 and 2 are ring fenced, in the end, you still have to generate the same PSA arrangements for the entire field, the entire operation. All the wells before they extinguish will eventually have to pay what profits they generate. It doesn't change that calculation.
It doesn't change the calculation. So
No, but
is it the
flow might be
timing?
changed.
Is it the timing of the revenue that is coming?
Yeah, that is important. There are two things that are important: the timing of the revenue, and secondly, the simple fact that you can't compare any contract for oil by isolating one factor. Every time you do that, you fall into error, because some countries might not even have a royalty in it and the oil. So, and they still might get more money than you, because in the contract you were trading off benefits from costs. So you have to look at the contract as a whole. So all we can say about the contract in Guyana is that of the 6 studies that have been done, 3 by NGOs, the average net cash flow from each project to Guyana's government falls between 52 and 60%. I consider that to be, for a region that had no oil before, a reasonable return. In fact, if you were to apply, let's say, the PSA arrangements in the United States to Guyana, the net cash flow from that will only be 40%, because the Americans want to stimulate the expansion of the private sector. They don't want to stimulate the expansion of government. So the contract has to serve the development purpose that you have in mind. So there's no right or wrong answer. You have to evaluate the trade-offs between every single action on the contract, and then evaluate the contract as a whole. So my position is that the contract as a whole yields this. Nobody can contest that, because it's done by 3 NGOs, 2 of which have been very highly supported. One is the Inter-American Development Bank. One is Open Oil, which has been responsible for the document that they had to retract in the end about the massive theft of our assets. Remember there's a document.
Right, I remember the document.
That the Guardian and so on that had to denounce eventually for a couple of years after. And one by the Inter-American Development Bank, and I consider none of those will have a motive of trying to defeat Guyana interest in this. And one by the University of Trinidad and Tobago. I think none of those agencies would definitely try to undermine the contributions that Guyana should get from the thing. So I take their judgments as representing a truthful measurement of what the net cash flow, and I've seen no error in the figures that they've published. So I use that. And I say, if that is the case, then the ABC of all oil contract comparison is that you do not, that was the first thing they teach in the textbook. Do not take any one item and compare it with others to value the effect of a particular contract arrangement. Because some countries may not even want that tax. They may not even have that royalty. And yet they might get a better return than you. Mm-hmm. Some countries just negotiate a share, leave the rest to the company to make their returns on.
Yeah. Professor, let me take you back to the ring fencing. So we have Exxon is saying no to ring fencing. The government of Guyana, through its vice president, Jack Dew, is saying no to ring fencing. Studies, I think 3 studies by the IMF, they're advising ring fencing. Talk to us, Professor.
I think all the studies will show that ring fencing advances the flow of revenue. It's likely more not to speed up the flow of revenues, but not to increase them necessarily, but to speed them up over the short run. And money now is worth more than money later. But some people might argue that money now for the government is less money now for the investor. And if the investor has less money, they might do less investing. So if you want to transition to a new arrangement, you might have to transition your contractors so that the new investor comes in that may be prepared to take the risk that the existing investor is not going to take. So these things are intricate, and there's no definitive answer until the studies are done.
That's where I was going now, before I get Thomas/WPA's view. The APNU, through its spokesperson, young Elson Lowe, who worked with you, is saying, Mr. Jagdeo and the government, before you make that take that definitive position that ring fencing in the end would lead to less revenue for us, you should do some studies. Where do you stand on that?
I think that's the correct position to take. The studies should be done. But I'm saying we don't do it with a naive vision that because you increase ring fencing, you increase the net revenue flow to Guyana.
Right. We've gotten that out of the way.
Investment, yeah.
But and that is important because
I think I leave that for the gutter press because they're making a point because that's what they want to make.
Yeah.
But there's a thing that requires careful study. You don't want to cut off the goose that laid the golden eggs. You don't want to cut your nose to spoil your face, as my mother used to say. You have to be careful because what has happened, we can see with the contract, is that there's a clear balance in the trade-off between stimulating investment and stimulating revenue. And the balance is tilted in favor of stimulating investment. Do we want to keep that posture, or do we think we want to go to stimulating revenue?
So on the one hand, there are those who are saying ring fencing, period, is good. And then you have the government on the other hand, and the other extreme is saying ring fencing is bad. And are you warning against both extremes?
I'm warning of doing anything without a study.
There you go.
Because the thing is the same thing with the audits. You see the unintended consequences of the audits already. That's what I'm fearful of. Because the offshore oil investments require special technologies, I don't want to make a case for anybody, so I don't want to prolong that point, but I'm saying we have to be careful that in trying to be punitive in one area or to extend the benefits, we don't spoil the whole baby party. That's the point we have to be very careful of. We have to balance the incentive effects of the contract against the revenue gains from the contract.
And Professor, this may be a redundant question because I assume that the answer to it is subsumed in the answers you gave us, but I will still ask it. Is there an economic crime in a firm, a company, using monies generated from one well to finance another well that is probably not generating as much income? Is that an economic crime in the oil industry?
No, nothing wrong with that. And anyhow, the economics of it will be, the taxation part of it will be adjudicated by the GRA. There's no a priori crime in using your profits from one area. You can't go to the farm, take the farm example I gave you. If you're making a profit with the aviary, that doesn't mean that you can't use the proceeds to finance the cattle on your farm.
Got you. So the WPA's
because the asset is your asset.
Yeah, the WPA's position through you is
that
to say
changes to the contract should be demonstrated and studied and proven as feasible to the public before they're made. That's my recommendation.
that's your
Because I'm fearful of people who are telling me a priori that this is, I don't think Lowe has made that point. I think he's called for studies,
yes,
if I read him correctly.
yes.
So I think
But you
that
are making an added point that what?
that we should have as a priority the continuous evaluation, the contract and its workings. It goes to the management of the project, which we be rating all the time. We don't see no studies, we don't see nothing. The government doesn't even carry a journal based on its oil. So we could see some academic or semi-academic studies that they have done to show whether this thing is going to be a wise move or not, and where the fallacy in their arguments or not might be existing. That is what we need, studies to tell us what to do. We can't assume it a priori.
Right. So you're therefore rejecting this whole thing that the contract is bad, we need to change it. Then the other side is saying, no, the contract is good and we don't need to change it. What you're saying is that we must constantly evaluate the contract.
The contract, yeah. That's an ongoing thing, yeah.
Sisters and brothers in the audience, I hope you all got that very, very clear. So there are the two entrenched positions. One is saying, renegotiate the contract now. The other side is saying, no renegotiation of the contract. Professor Clive Thomas and the WPA are saying, do constant evaluation of the contract. And out of that evaluation will come the choices that are before you. Professor Thomas?
Yes, and the thing is that to widen the area of deliberation over whatever they're doing. So it doesn't come as a secret study that somebody do in some parlor or in some office and hand over and say, this is a study. Encourage public debate in it. Because the more eyes go on it, the more the scrutiny, and more any possible errors in it become manifest or not, or any good parts of it may become visible so that people could recognize it.
Professor Thomas.
In other words, we want a clear, semi-academic spotlight, research spotlight on all recommendations of the based on the country.
All right. Two practical questions.
Continuous.
Two practical questions. Who should be doing this evaluation?
I think only the government has the capacity right now.
And what method should the government use? Should it set up a group
I
of
think they should
experts?
be publishing a journal. They should be publishing a journal, and the journal will be established as an independent journal. It'll have its editorial staff and so forth. It would solicit articles. It would generate discussion in the field, and the people within the government offices would be allowed, as every academic article or journal is allowed, to make submissions based on the merit to be accepted or not for publication.
Should that journal be housed, let's say, the University of Guyana?
Well, I would say yes, because I'm from there.
Right.
But the Ministry of Finance could very well do it too.
Could very well do it. Should the government assemble a group of quote-unquote experts and both from the academic community and from the professional community to form the basis of this group to do this evaluation? Or is there another way you will propose?
Well, if there can be a body of independent experts evolve out of this comment here, I don't know. If people are interested, they might contact me, or people might contact you. They might be in a formal meeting and a process would drop something, but I think that's the way we have to go. Because every important economic activity in every significant country is surrounded by journals dedicated to their activity. I know we have oil now, but oil now is primarily for weekly publication, thoughtful opinions and so on. But the research papers and that type of thing, you have to encourage it to develop. You have to get the faculties at the university, the staff at the GGMC or wherever it is, the Ministry of Finance, to see that this is an outlet for their thinking and an opportunity to enhance the position of that. And then it becomes something of a beacon where scholars might refer to Guyana's position on oil through the references they see to the studies published in that journal.
Professor Clive Thomas here, throwing out a couple of proposals as a way of intervening in the current discourse on oil and gas. He's saying on behalf of the WPA that rather than taking entrenched positions about the contract, that there should be constant evaluation of the contract. Towards this end, they are proposing the setting up of a journal which would generate ideas going forward, not just about the contract, but about the industry in general. And as regards the oil, the ring fencing debate that is going on, a similar proposal that there should be studies to determine how you deal with the question of ring fencing. Professor Thomas, any closing ideas?
I think I gave you a lot to write down there. let's see what happens by next week.
Well, Professor Clive Thomas, thank you again for coming through. Quite an enriching discussion today, both in the reflections in the first part of the program and the second part, where we discuss directly oil and gas. Thank you very much.
Mention it, David.
And to your audience, as usual, always a big thank you for staying with us. It was quite a program today. The reflections in the first half of the program really putting into context what is happening today, put it in its larger historical context, not only as it relates to Guyana, but as it relates to our region, the Caribbean region. And then in the second part, really, in a clear way, offering an alternative to the discourses that we're having on the oil and gas at the present. And this is always good for a country, that we have more than one, or as they say, multiple poles of ideas, and we can only be better for it. Professor Thomas, elder of the WPA, long-standing member, founder member of the WPA, weighing in. I hope we have clarified for you a number of troubling issues, and I also hope that we have given hope that we can do better and we can get this thing right. Because at the end of the day, this is not about the PPP government. They're the ones who are in office now. But we have to think about oil and gas beyond them. And perhaps in our critique of the government, we tend to give them ownership of the oil and gas industry. And while they, with their politics of domination, may project that ownership, at the end of the day, they don't own it. And we have to project, in fact, impose on the situation the ownership, the national ownership, the ownership by the people of Guyana and not by the government of Guyana. I think we have made some strides today in clarifying a lot of those issues. See you all tomorrow.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region for we woman and we children.